Our next speaker, we're going to do a little bit of a one-on-one intimate discussion, specifically on housing, which I'm very excited to explore. Veronica joined California Coalition for Rural Housing, also known as CCRH, in February 2019 as the research manager. Now, as the Director of Policy and Research, she supports CCRH's advocacy, programmatic, and technical assistance work by researching and promoting effective housing solutions. Through her work as policy director at the Sacramento Housing Alliance, Veronica has been an advocate for affordable homes and healthy communities in the Sacramento region for more than 7 years. Veronica has worked to understand the intricacies of the full range of housing justice issues, from development financing to tenants' rights, and from transportation access to sustainable community practices. She is committed to deepening her sector's ability to approach the work with an equity lens and articulate a holistic vision that connects housing to other sectors, such as racial equity, transportation, food access, and climate change. Veronica is originally from Minnesota, and Veronica holds a Master of Public Policy from Mills College in Oakland, California. Welcome to the stage, Veronica.
Thank you so much, Ephraim.
Yeah, so happy to have you. How are you doing?
Good.
Good. We're going to just jump right in. And initially, with most of the speakers and panelists, we just try to get a good understanding of their foundation and what even drives their passion for the work. So can you tell us a little bit about how you are and how you came to find your passion in housing advocacy?
Sure. So I'd done some housing work as a kid. I'd done Habitat for Humanity builds with my church and that kind of charity-based housing work. And then I was off in Oakland getting my degree at Mills College in public policy, because public policy is for problem solvers, and I thought that was going to be me. And midway through that degree, my mom lost her house during the foreclosure crisis. And so I was there thinking, if this public policy degree can't fix the problem I would most like to fix, which is keeping my mom in my childhood home, then what good is it? And that really got me interested in the housing world. And from there, let me move into the Sacramento Housing Alliance's work so that, I could help everybody's mom keep their house.
That's incredible. Yeah, it's always so interesting how we transform these experiences into the passions that we have, but that direct experience is vital. And so I so appreciate that. Can you share with the audience and myself? I mean, we had a conversation and I was just sitting there like blown away by the work that y'all are doing, but it's just so important for us to flesh that out. So can you share the work that CCRH does with elders and tribal communities respectively?
Yeah, absolutely. So the California Coalition for Rural Housing officials, community advocates, and those members make up the core of our work. And so with elders, we acknowledge that rural California is disproportionately older than California as a whole, also disproportionately likely to be homeowners. So one of the things we've done is work with a program called Capable, which brings in-home healthcare workers, folks who do housing development and housing repairs, and essentially a group that brings together all kinds of different disciplines to help people age in place, because that's been an important part of our work with elders, is thinking about how do we make sure that people can grow old in our rural communities and stay safe, stay in their homes, in an affordable home, but also increasingly thinking about the accessibility of that home, because folks aren't going to want to move away from the communities they've lived in, aren't going to want to move away from the homes they own just because there isn't a bathtub grab rail or a ramp, right? So we want to make sure people can stay safe and secure even as they age in these communities. We also do some work with elders in our asset building work, particularly around helping elders avoid financial scams, which is unfortunately increasingly common. So going out and doing trainings, your grandson does not need Walmart gift cards to get you out of jail. That's not a thing. Don't give anybody your social security number, that kind of thing. Making sure that our elders can maintain their financial security, both in their home and outside of it. And then with tribal communities have been a long-time focus of the California Coalition for Rural Housing. We've done extensive research around the housing needs of tribal communities. We've run policy, for example, AB 1010, which I believe was 2 years ago, which opened up the access for California state funding programs around housing to all tribes and tribal entities. And I'll get into this a little bit later, but we're running additional bills now to create a grant program that's designed specifically by tribal communities and for tribal communities. So every year we host a roundtable for all of our housing partners who work in tribal communities and are representing tribal housing entities to talk about what their needs are for the coming year and really try to move those into policy, advocacy, and research opportunities.
Amazing. That's really powerful work. And it's interesting too, because, I think from the outside looking in, financial scams, you're like, oh, well, of course, why could, it's obvious, but they're adapted to every generation. I mean, I have peers my age that have lost access to multiple social media networks because they're falling prey to these like Cash App scams. And so it's when you're in it, they're very, what's the word? Those financial scams are very good at trapping people and tricking people.
Yeah. I'll be honest, I fell for one the other week, and I could hear the coworker that does that work making fun of me. Like, this is exactly what the PowerPoint would have told me not to do.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So yeah, those financial scams can be so dangerous. And I've noticed also the trends around climate disaster, for example, even what happened in Puerto Rico, that those same types of scams end up exploiting our elders.
Oh my gosh, yeah, there's so much around like this. I'm the person to talk to get your insurance payout. Just give me all your information and I'll get your FEMA money for you.
Yeah. Exactly. And how terrible to exploit the crisis that people are experiencing. Now, the California Coalition on Rural Housing, we would love to hear, fleshed out history. But then when we were speaking, you had talked about those 5 pillars of service that, or the foundational aspects of the work that you focus on. And I would love to hear about that.
Absolutely. So the quick hit on our history is that we've been around for more than 40 years now. We were actually the first statewide housing organization and formed in the wake of a farm worker housing conference. So farm worker housing is another key piece of our work alongside tribal communities. And those 5 pillars you were talking about, of course, you heard my title at the start. My favorite are policy advocacy and research. We also do quite a bit of technical assistance, so helping tribes, local governments, residents access different state funding programs to facilitate sustainable communities and affordable housing. And then we also do asset building work. So our scam prevention is kind of under there. We also help folks do different kinds of matched savings programs to assist with house down payments or college goals for folks in our members' communities. So residents of affordable housing of developers we work with. And then finally, we do a lot of leadership development. So as we get deeper into this work, we've realized that thinking about developing affordable housing is not a career path that you tend to get when you're filling out a survey after your PSATs. Not a lot of people know that that's an option. And there's a real lack of diversity across, basically all axes, but particularly racial diversity in the housing development field. So we have an internship program that's been running, I think, for more than 30 years that does training for people of color interested in getting into housing development. And there's a sort of summer course curriculum, and then they're paired with one of our members for an internship program. And we're really happy to see that that's been now replicated in the Bay Area with the Bay HIP program run by MPH. And we are in the process of launching a similar leadership development program for mid-career professionals, so that we're not just kind of hanging folks out to dry after they're no longer young. What else do you need as somebody who's going to continue to advance in this work?
That's amazing. That's really, really amazing. I still cannot quite believe the breadth of the work that CCRH does. It's like overwhelming. And so we're going to kind of dive into those pillars. And so one of the pillars that really piqued my interest was that leadership development, specifically where Black, Indigenous, people of color, future housing developers are empowered and trained for success. Can you tell us more about that program?
Yeah, so that was really sparked by realizing the difference between who's developing and offering the housing and who's living in it, right? And ideally, we would want to see housing developments created by the same populations they're designed to serve, especially because that can really change the game when it comes to what kind of housing is being built. So just my favorite kind of easy example is a lot of the state funding programs don't consider larger family sizes. So there's really this drive for like dense housing. There's this drive for as many units of housing as possible. And so the impulse is to build a ton of like studio units in one high rise. But if you're really looking at who needs affordable housing, there's a pretty limited population that wants to live in like a micro apartment in downtown. A lot of times you want to serve families. You want a family where, you know, your grandparents are there. You can have your nephew stay over. You have multiple kids. And that takes multiple bedrooms, right? And a lot of times the funding programs don't acknowledge that, can't really like reward that in the same way. And so getting folks who come from different family backgrounds than the state kind of anticipates changes what's getting built. And that's why I think it's so critical for us to move forward all kinds of diversity in our housing developer profession.
Thank you so much, Veronica. And I know that this next question is probably much more your purview, specifically at the work at CCRH, and it's around the policy advocacy that you had mentioned earlier. And so what is the coalition, the California Coalition on Rural Housing doing in this area?
Let me say one more thing about the internship program, or they'd be mad at me. They have a really great Instagram. So check out the internships Instagram program. That's where they post all of whenever the applications are open, all the great things the interns are doing. So much more fun than what I'm going to talk about policy-wise.
What is the Instagram handle?
Yeah, you would think I knew the handle, wouldn't you? Yeah.
No problem. We can look it up and we can share that with the audience then later. No problem.
I'm too old. The interns are way cooler than me. Policy-wise. So we're in an interesting point. You're catching us sort of at the beginning of our policy year. We have an annual summit where we gather all of our members together. And instead of doing the kind of panels where experts talk at you, we have a sort of unconference model where all of our members come together, discuss issues across different areas. So for example, talking about what's coming up in natural disasters. We've had members in recent years who've lost developments to wildfire, who've seen really high insurance costs in the communities they're trying to serve, like prohibitively high. And so they'll sit around and talk about the issues that have come up in those arenas and develop action items that we can turn into things we're going to do in either our research or our policy advocacy sides. So one of the ideas that emerged from our disaster work in recent years was the idea of having a bridge loan fund, essentially because there is federal disaster relief money through the Community Development Block Grant Program, but that can often take 2 to 7 years to hit the ground. So we'll know that money's coming from the feds, but we can't build anything with it yet. And so we've been trying to run a bill that would do a bridge loan and take state money and basically lend that money out sooner so that the fund can be replenished by the federal dollars when they show up, but we can start building now. So that's the kind of ideas that emerged from that summit. Our summit's coming up in a couple weeks. We are sort of resting on our laurels around some of our policy wins this year. Alongside many of our other affordable housing colleagues, we helped out with AB 2011, which was kind of this grand compromise around how to streamline affordable housing production and kind of do some compromising between housing advocates and labor advocates so that everyone who's building housing has a livable wage in the construction process. And then one of our signature pieces was AB 1654, which created, which made it so that when we increase the low-income housing tax credit for traditional affordable housing, there's a contemporaneous increase in the farm worker housing tax credit. So that as we decide that affordable housing is where we need to put our tax credits, we're making sure that we're considering the needs of the farm workers in California. And that's also going to create the state's first statewide study of farm worker housing need, because right now that's all been pretty patchwork.
Yeah, that's really, really incredible, this kind of advocacy. And I appreciate that you're trying to mitigate some of the natural bureaucracy that shows up, especially with the funding and the way that you creatively kind of thought about how that money can be spent as soon as possible and then reimbursed later. So that's a really creative solution around that problem. Excuse me. Technical assistance remains such a powerful resource for communities all across the state in rural communities. What does this technical assistance look like?
Well, yeah. So, I mean, it's so necessary in rural communities. I've encountered multiple people in my work at CCRH who are in charge of both a jurisdiction's entire housing program and their entire child support collection network. So this is one guy who has to both build all the housing they need and like go hunt down deadbeat parents, which is an insane amount of work for one person. So what our technical assistance looks like is a lot of things. Some of it's as simple as keeping a guy such as that up to date on these legislative changes. California is trying to solve its housing crisis as fast as possible. There may be 200, 300 bill ideas that come forward and 20 or 30 bills that get passed. And so where's the like one sheet that's going to explain what that means to you when you go into the office tomorrow and build a house, right? We also do a lot of work around accessing state funding programs. So helping folks create their applications, make a competitive application, making folks aware of when different notices of funding availability are coming out. We have one major contract right now around that with the mobile home parks, manufactured housing. So that's a massively overlooked part of affordable housing that's really relevant to rural communities. There's a state program that should be kind of the best thing we've got going, like help residents buy their parks, help parks make infrastructure upgrades, keeping rents affordable, and it simply hasn't been accessed in any meaningful way for 10 years. And so we're out there trying to make folks aware of it, help people put applications together, work with the state to ensure that that program is being used as it should. And that's happening with that program, but many others. And then there's also like this increasing push for a lot of different planning grants, a lot of different multi-organizational coalition type applications, like you see with the Transformative Climate Communities program, which sounds like a great idea. From an urban perspective, I'm like, yeah, many organizations should work together. But then when you get out to a rural community, even having the ability to like coordinate 10 different groups coming to a meeting to create the application is a real need.
Yeah. Wow, that's really fascinating. Thank you so much for sharing that. Another incredible priority of the organization is ensuring that communities have stable and affordable homes for rent and have the financial skills and resources to make long-term economic progress. So how does that asset building program that you had mentioned at the beginning at CCRH support that community?
Yeah, so I think in a couple different ways. I mean, we work closely with the California Reinvestment Coalition and the National Reinvestment Coalition to kind of talk about the broader web of financial needs that the families we're serving have. So sometimes that looks like credit repair workshops. Some of our members move families from their rental housing to some of their home ownership opportunities. So you could be living in an affordable rental unit and then be receiving like credit counseling and education to prepare you to be a homeowner that's going to be working with the same developer fundamentally. And then similarly, those kind of matching programs around how do you save up for college at this time? Then in those situations, like the developer is doing some philanthropic giving with that, and we're matching it with subsidy programs so that for every $1 a family saves, there's $3 in a savings account for when their kids go to college. Simply because in a lot of these rural communities, the affordable housing developer is a backbone of financial stability in that community, more so than in an urban community where you might have like 3 different organizations that are each focused on a different aspect of that.
Right. Wow. That's such an interesting concept. Even when I think about like asset building, my parents living in rural Pennsylvania, they have yet to have owned any property and to have gained some kind of technical assistance like that. They continue to rent to this day, and that is just what it is. And naturally, we know how wealth is built across generations, and then invested in those future generations. And so that's a really powerful part of the program that you offer. Thank you so much. For over 40 years, CCRH has spearheaded and participated in groundbreaking research on housing and community development issues in California. What are some of the research initiatives you are proud of, and what's on the horizon that excites you?
Yeah, so one of the things I really love about CCRH is that there is, even though we have these 5 pillars and they all seem super huge, there's a very iterative process that feeds into them all. So for example, like I said, we ran that bill, we passed this bill that's going to increase farm worker housing tax credits and do this study. We're going to hopefully, with some of our partners, participate in that study, which is in turn going to tell us what some of the farm worker housing needs are in a more like statistically robust way. And from there, we'll get our policy ideas. And that's how a lot of our work happens is we go out, we do this technical assistance, we collect from our technical assistance clients, oh, here's the barrier to using this program. I really wanted to convert this motel, but I couldn't because of this. Those kinds of issues. And then on the research side, collect those issues, make sure that they're indicative, right? They're not just like one story, but they're a whole story that we can tell and we can back up with some statistics. And then from that research, develop our policy proposals. And that's happening now again with our tribal housing side of things. We participated in the state's first statewide tribal housing study. Came through with a bunch of very specific recommendations about funding programs and how they could be better adapted to meet tribes' needs. And we've been working our way down that list, knocking out okay, this line needs to be removed from this funding program, or this whole requirement needs to be removed. And ultimately, we'd gotten to the point where a couple of years of trying to do that on a program by program basis hasn't been sufficient. Even though tribes can apply for any kind of state housing funding, it's not working out. And thus the policy idea for next session is, what if there's their own tribal housing grant program?
Wow. It's really such incredible work that's happening at CCRH. I'm about to throw you a bit of a curveball. I'm curious, is there any kind of call to action, maybe even criticism, that the wider community, especially in our urban settings, in ways that we can show up and step up to support the work that's happening at CCRH?
Gosh, I mean, remember rural California exists. I mean, I'm part of so many beautiful, beautiful housing coalitions, and I love them. But so much of the time, the air is taken up between LA invented this one way to do transit-oriented housing, and San Francisco invented this other way to do transit-oriented housing. And those two arguments are just going to happen, and that's our time for the day, right? And so I have to be in the corner being well, we don't even have transit routes in most of these areas.
Right.
Did you know that car share is a thing, or van pools, or because there's all kinds of innovative ideas coming out of rural communities, but they simply don't get heard out in a lot of these situations. So I wish we were at a different place in the legislative cycle where I could say sign on to this particular letter. I will say calruralhousing.org. You can sign up for our newsletter, and some of the material for the tribal housing grant program I was talking about is there. So you can see our case-making document, our sort of draft framework. That's all under 2022 legislative priorities in the little drop-down menu at top. So stay tuned for that kind of explicit call to action. But in general, just I think unpacking a little bit what assumptions might be made about what California is.
Yeah, that's really incredible. And I think you're right. I mean, the conversation always prioritizes, which is kind of why we're even having this this theme for this event, is because the conversation naturally steamrolls rural communities, and I think urban settings naturally kind of blanket assume, and then it's not maybe not even a conscious move, but it just naturally steamrolls their desires and their needs. And we owe so much to rural America. I mean, we were talking yesterday to Quentin Bell, who came to us from TKO, from the Knights and Orchids Foundation, and their work, it's in Selma, Alabama, which is the cradle for the civil rights movement, but we so often just kind of oh, that's rural, and that, so I think we just owe so much to these communities, and I'm so grateful for your time with us today. I did get that Instagram handle. I'm just going to announce that here. Let me just look at this real quick. If anyone is interested to check out these hip interns on Instagram, their social is at CCRH_internship. Again, that's at CCRH_internship. And Veronica, thank you so much for your time. We will definitely be in contact and foster community from here. It's been such an honor to have you. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. This is so fabulous.
Yes, amazing.